The phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon in June 2006, and Michael Anthony should have known better than to answer it. He was in his home studio in Newport Beach, working on bass lines for a session that had nothing to do with Van Halen. When Eddie Van Halen's name appeared on the caller ID, Michael felt something twist in his gut. They had been brothers for 30 years. They had built an empire together. They had survived David Lee Roth's ego, Sammy Hagar's departure, and Eddie's spiraling addiction. Surely they could survive whatever this phone call was about to bring. He answered on the third ring. Eddie's voice came through flat and emotionless, stripped of all warmth and camaraderie that had defined 3 decades of friendship. No greeting, no small talk, no preamble. Just 7 words that would shatter everything Michael Anthony had built his adult life around. 7 words that would erase him from the history of one of the greatest rock bands ever created. But the real devastation wasn't just in those 7 words. It was in what Eddie had been planning behind Michael's back for months, a systematic erasure that went far beyond simply replacing a bass player. If you've ever wondered what happens when rock success collides with family loyalty, when millions corrupt decades of friendship, when addiction destroys bonds that seemed unbreakable, then you need to hear this story. Consider subscribing, because the truth about Michael Anthony's dismissal reveals something troubling about Van Halen that fans are only now beginning to understand. To understand the magnitude of betrayal, you have to go back to 1974 when Michael Anthony showed up to audition for a band called Mammoth, rehearsing in a Pasadena basement. Eddie and Alex Van Halen were Dutch immigrants driven by a father who believed musical talent was the key to success in America. Michael was different from previous bass players. He understood something crucial, sometimes the most important thing a bass player can do is support the vision rather than compete with it. From that first rehearsal, Michael Anthony became the glue holding Van Halen together. While Eddie revolutionized guitar playing, while David Lee Roth commanded stages, while Alex anchored everything with powerful drumming, Michael did something essential. He sang the high harmonies that gave Van Halen its distinctive vocal sound. He provided melodic bass lines that complemented Eddie's revolutionary guitar work. He was the peacemaker, the diplomat, smoothing over conflicts between egos that could have destroyed the band a dozen times over. Through the late 70s and 80s, as Van Halen became one of the biggest bands in the world, Michael Anthony was there for every triumph. He was there when their debut album went diamond. He was there when Eruption changed guitar playing forever. He was there through the cocaine excess, the stadium tours, the platinum albums, the MTV domination. When David Lee Roth quit in 1985, Michael helped navigate finding a replacement. When Sammy Hagar joined, Michael was instrumental in making that transition work, his harmonies blending perfectly with Hagar's voice. But beneath the success and brotherhood, something was changing in Eddie Van Halen, something dark that would eventually consume everything, including his oldest friendships. Eddie's drinking had always been part of Van Halen mythology, but by the early 2000s, it wasn't rock excess anymore. It was addiction in its purest, most destructive form. Eddie's marriage to Valerie Bertinelli had collapsed under the weight of his drinking. His relationship with Sammy Hagar deteriorated until Hagar quit in 1996, unable to deal with Eddie's unpredictability. What Michael didn't know was that the Van Halen brothers had been having conversations about the band's future that didn't include him. Wolfgang Van Halen, Eddie's son, was 15 in 2004 and had been playing bass since childhood. Eddie had been teaching him, preparing him for something nobody outside the family knew about. The plan wasn't just having Wolfgang sit in occasionally. The plan was to replace Michael Anthony entirely, making Van Halen a true family band with Eddie, Alex, and Wolfgang as the core. But replacing Michael wasn't just about bringing in a new bass player. It was about control. It was about money. It was about equity in the Van Halen Corporation, established when the four original members, Eddie, Alex, Roth, and Michael, were equal partners. Michael still held significant ownership stake representing millions in future earnings, merchandising rights, and catalog royalties. To make Van Halen a family business, the Van Halen brothers needed that equity back. And that's when the systematic erasure of Michael Anthony began, starting with something so petty and cruel that it shocked even longtime Van Halen insiders. In 2004, Van Halen released a live album called The Best of Both Worlds. When the album artwork was prepared, someone made a shocking decision. In archival photos used in packaging, Michael Anthony's face had been digitally obscured, blurred out as if he were a criminal whose identity needed protecting, or as if he had never existed. In group photos, his image was manipulated beyond recognition. In some shots, he had been removed entirely, leaving awkward gaps. The rock press caught on immediately. Fans were outraged. How could Van Halen erase a founding member who had been there for every album, every tour, every moment of glory? The official explanation was murky. Something about photo permissions nobody believed. But people close to the band knew the truth. This wasn't about photo rights. This was Eddie Van Halen, backed by Alex, sending a message. This was the beginning of the end, a warning shot Michael either didn't see or chose to ignore. Sammy Hagar publicly defended Michael, calling the photo manipulation disrespectful and childish. Hagar knew what the public was only beginning to suspect. The photo erasure wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger pattern of pushing Michael out of the Van Halen legacy he had helped build with his own hands and voice. But even as warning signs multiplied, Michael Anthony couldn't believe Eddie would actually make the final cut, that their brotherhood could be severed by a single phone call. The 2004 reunion tour with Hagar had been a disaster. Eddie's drinking was out of control. Shows were canceled. Performances were erratic. Michael, caught in the middle, tried being the peacemaker as always, but this time it wasn't enough. When the tour ended, Hagar swore he would never work with Eddie again. The band went on hiatus, and Michael went back to Newport Beach, doing session work, waiting for the inevitable call that Van Halen was ready to work again. That call came, but not as Michael expected. In early 2006, rumors circulated that Van Halen was planning another reunion with David Lee, Roth. Michael heard the rumors, but wasn't worried. He had survived the transition from Roth to Hagar. He had survived Hagar's departure and the Gary Cherone disaster. He had survived 30 years of Van Halen drama. Surely he would survive this too. What Michael didn't know was that behind the scenes, the Van Halen brothers had already decided. Wolfgang was ready. He had been practicing, learning every Van Halen bass line, preparing to step into Michael's shoes. More importantly, the legal groundwork had been laid. Lawyers consulted, contracts reviewed. The Van Halen Corporation's structure was being reorganized to minimize Michael's financial stake and maximize the family's control. All that remained was the notification. And on that Tuesday afternoon in June 2006, Eddie Van Halen finally made that call, and the words he spoke would haunt Michael Anthony forever. The conversation was brief. Michael would later describe it with pain that never diminished. Eddie's voice was cold, businesslike, stripped of emotion, suggesting regret or hesitation. No explanation of why. No discussion of alternatives. no acknowledgement of 3 decades of brotherhood. Eddie simply informed Michael that Van Halen was moving forward with the David Lee Roth reunion tour, and Wolfgang would be playing bass. When Michael tried to ask questions, tried to understand why he was being replaced after 30 years of loyalty, Eddie cut him off. The decision was made, not up for debate. Then came the sentence that would define the betrayal. "You're not in the band anymore." Not, "We're making a change," or "We're going in a different direction." Just the blunt, brutal truth delivered with all the warmth of a corporate layoff notice. After 30 years, after building an empire together, after the brotherhood and loyalty and decades of putting Van Halen first. The call ended shortly after. Michael too stunned to form coherent arguments. Eddie offering nothing more because there was nothing more to say. Michael sat in his studio long after that call ended, bass guitar still in his hands, session work forgotten. He tried to process what had just happened, tried to understand how everything he had built could be taken away so casually. He thought about calling Alex Van Halen, but he already knew what Alex would say. Alex had always backed Eddie's decisions. The Van Halen brothers were a unit, bound by blood in a way that no amount of shared musical history could overcome. Michael was talented, loyal, essential, but he wasn't family. And in the end, that was all that mattered. But the phone call was just the beginning, because what came next was a legal and financial battle that would expose just how calculated Eddie's actions had been. Within weeks, Michael received legal documents making the situation worse. Not only was he being removed from the band, but the Van Halen Corporation was restructuring to significantly reduce his equity stake. Eddie and Alex were using Michael's dismissal as leverage to renegotiate the financial terms of his involvement in Van Halen's past and future. They wanted him to sign away a portion of his ownership for a buyout, generous by normal standards, but a fraction of what his continued stake would be worth over time. Michael consulted lawyers and financial advisors. The advice was consistent: don't sign. The Van Halen catalog was worth millions, and as the bass player and high harmony vocalist on every classic album, Michael had a legitimate claim to significant earnings. But fighting the Van Halen brothers in court would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating. It would air decades of dirty laundry. Michael faced an impossible choice: fight for what he deserved and risk destroying everything Van Halen represented, or accept the buyout and move on with dignity intact. The rock community watched with fascination and disgust. Sammy Hagar continued publicly supporting Michael, hiring him for solo projects and his supergroup Chickenfoot. Other musicians quietly expressed disapproval of how Michael was being treated, though few criticized Eddie publicly. Eddie was still a guitar god, still influential, still capable of making or breaking careers. The unspoken message was clear: don't get on Eddie's bad side. The 2007 reunion tour with Roth went forward with Wolfgang on bass. To Wolfgang's credit, at only 16 and thrust into an impossibly difficult situation, he handled himself with remarkable professionalism. He learned the parts, played them well, and avoided the worst criticism that could have been directed at him. But no matter how well Wolfgang played, something was missing. The high harmonies Michael provided weren't quite the same. The chemistry was different. And hanging over everything was Michael's ghost, the founding member erased from the current incarnation, but never from history. And then came the moment that crystallized the true cost of what Eddie had done. A moment Michael would describe as more painful than the original phone call. In 2012, Van Halen released A Different Kind of Truth, their first studio album with Roth since 1984. The album reached #2 on Billboard, proving Van Halen could still create commercially viable music. But for Michael, the album represented something else. Physical proof he had been replaced, that Van Halen was moving forward without him and apparently doing fine. Wolfgang was credited as bass player. Though rumors persisted, Eddie had actually played many bass parts himself. Michael watched from outside as the band he helped create continued without him. He saw interviews where Eddie and Alex discussed the new album, the creative process, the future of Van Halen, and Michael's name was rarely mentioned. When journalists brought up his dismissal, Eddie's responses were dismissive, sometimes cruel. He suggested Michael had never been a critical component, that he was easily replaceable, that family came first and business decisions had to be made. The revisionist history was stunning. Eddie was attempting to minimize Michael's contributions to a legacy Michael helped build. But perhaps the most devastating revelation came years later, when those close to Eddie revealed what was really behind Michael's dismissal, and it had nothing to do with musical ability. Eddie Van Halen died on October 6, 2020, after a long battle with cancer. In the months following, as tributes poured in, some close to Eddie began speaking more openly about his final years, his regrets, the decisions he wished he could take back. One revelation was about Michael Anthony. According to multiple sources, the decision to remove Michael had been driven primarily by control and money. Eddie wanted Van Halen to be a family legacy continuing through Wolfgang. Having Michael as an equity partner complicated that vision financially and symbolically. But there was another factor, more psychological. Eddie's addiction and control issues intensified over the years, fed by pain from his failing health. Hip replacement surgery that never healed properly. Cancer diagnosis kept hidden for years. In that state of decline, Eddie became increasingly paranoid about loyalty, about who could be trusted. Alex was family, blood, unquestionably loyal. Wolfgang was his son, his legacy. Roth was a hired performer, but Michael Anthony, despite 3 decades of loyalty, was not family. And in Eddie's deteriorating mental state, that made him a liability. The tragedy was that Michael had never given Eddie reason to doubt his loyalty. In 30 years, Michael had been Van Halen's most reliable member, the one who showed up on time, did the work without complaint, supported every decision even when he privately disagreed. His loyalty had been absolute, and that loyalty had been rewarded with betrayal. When news of Eddie's death reached Michael, he was gracious in public statements, praising Eddie's musical genius and expressing sadness. But in private moments, Michael admitted his feelings were complicated. There was genuine grief for the loss, for the end of an era, for the friend Eddie had once been. But there was also unresolved anger, pain that never fully healed, questions that would never be answered. Why had Eddie done it that way? Why couldn't there have been a conversation, some path forward that honored their shared history? Today, Michael Anthony is 70 years old, still playing music, still performing with Sammy Hagar, still bringing joy to fans who remember Van Halen's golden age. He has rebuilt his career, found success outside the Van Halen shadow, proven he was always more than just Eddie's bass player. But the scar remains. In interviews, when his dismissal comes up, you can still see the pain in his eyes, still hear the hurt when he talks about that phone call in 2006. The legacy of Van Halen is complicated now. The music remains brilliant, revolutionary, influential. But the story behind it is darker than many fans want to acknowledge. It's about how success corrupts friendships, how addiction poisons judgment, How family loyalty becomes a weapon against those who aren't blood relatives. Michael Anthony's dismissal stands as one of rock's most callous betrayals. A reminder that talent and loyalty aren't always enough when money and control are at stake. Wolfgang Van Halen has tried to honor Michael's contributions in recent years. In interviews, he speaks respectfully of Michael, acknowledges the difficult position he was put in, recognizes his joining came at Michael's expense. But Wolfgang also defends his father's decision, argues family businesses are complicated, suggests outsiders can never fully understand the dynamics. There's truth in that. We can never know exactly what conversations happened behind closed doors. But we do know this. On a Tuesday afternoon in June 2006, Michael Anthony answered a phone call from Eddie Van Halen, and in minutes, 30 years of brotherhood were erased. 7 words ended a partnership that created some of rock's most enduring music. And while Van Halen continued without Michael, while albums were made and tours completed, something essential was lost that day. Something that can never be recovered. Trust, loyalty, brotherhood. The very things that made Van Halen possible were destroyed by the same forces that made them successful. Ego, money, and the corrosive belief that blood family is the only loyalty that truly matters. Michael Anthony learned that lesson the hardest way possible, and the rest of us learned it watching his pain play out in public. A cautionary tale about what happens when rock dreams collide with ugly realities of business and family and addiction. The phone call lasted less than 5 minutes. The pain has lasted a lifetime.